There are moments in life when happiness doesn't slowly fade, it collapses. One second you are standing on solid ground, convinced you know who the people beside you are, and the next, the floor gives way, and you realize the truth has been waiting patiently for you to look down. For Nia Brooks, that moment arrived wrapped in ivory paper, tied with a silk ribbon, and placed gently into her hands by the woman she trusted most. It was supposed to be a simple celebration, nothing extravagant, just dinner, laughter, and the quiet comfort of being seen. Nia had turned 33 that evening, and after a week of back-to-back regulatory meetings at her biotech firm, she had wanted nothing more than something small and sincere. A reminder that the long hours, the pressure, the constant responsibility, it was all worth it. She didn't know yet that the gift she was about to open carried a price far higher than the one printed on a receipt, and that by the end of the night, her life would already be splitting into before and after. If you've ever trusted someone completely, loved them, defended them, believed in them, stay with this story. And if you find yourself leaning closer as it unfolds, you already know what to do. Tap like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and follow along. Stories like this don't just entertain, they reveal things we recognize in ourselves. The restaurant overlooked Elliott Bay, all soft lighting and low voices. The kind of place where conversations felt private, even in a full room. Ethan Hale sat across from Nia, his hand resting easily over hers, his smile polished in that familiar way that had once made her feel safe. Ethan was a venture capital partner, confident, persuasive, always in control. The kind of man people trusted instinctively. Beside Nia sat Maren Vale, her best friend of nearly a decade. Maren leaned back in her chair, glass of wine in hand, watching Nia with an intensity that could be mistaken for affection. She worked in strategic communications, shaping narratives for founders and public figures, turning chaos into clean headlines. Maren had always said she loved words because they let her decide which truth people saw. When dessert plates were cleared, Maren reached under the table and brought out a small box. "I wanted to give this to you last," she said, her voice soft, deliberate. "Because you deserve to be celebrated properly." Nia laughed, already shaking her head. "Maren, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," Maren cut in gently. "You give so much to everyone else. Let someone give something back to you." The box was heavier than it looked. When Nia lifted the lid, the room seemed to go quiet. Not because it actually had, but because her breath caught. Inside lay a bracelet, elegant and unmistakable, its design timeless, deliberate, intimate. The kind of piece people associated with commitment, with permanence. "Oh my God," Nia whispered. "Maren, this is too much." Maren smiled, wide and warm. "It's just a gift. Don't make it complicated." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes flicking briefly to the bracelet before returning to Nia's face. "It's beautiful," he said smoothly. "You have great taste, Maren." Something about the way he said it, too casual, too quick, slid past Nia's awareness in the moment. She was too busy feeling grateful, loved, chosen. They toasted, they laughed, they took a photo. From the outside, it looked perfect. Later that night, back in the apartment Nia shared with Ethan, she slipped off her heels and set her purse on the kitchen counter. As she did, a folded piece of paper slid free and landed near her hand. She frowned. Ethan had worn a blazer that evening. She assumed it must have fallen from one of the pockets while they were getting ready. She picked it up without thinking. It was a credit card statement. Nia almost put it back down. She wasn't the type to snoop. She believed privacy was a form of respect. But her eyes caught on a line halfway down the page, and her body reacted before her mind did. Jewelry purchase, $12,480. Date, 3 days prior. Her heartbeat thudded loud enough that she became aware of her own breathing. Slowly, deliberately, she looked down at her wrist. The bracelet gleamed softly under the kitchen light. $12,480. The exact tier, the exact timing. For a long moment, Nia stood completely still, suspended between disbelief and instinct. She told herself there had to be an explanation. There always was. Ethan was thoughtful. Maren was generous. Coincidences happened, but somewhere deep inside her, a quieter voice spoke, one she had learned to ignore over the years. This isn't coincidence. This is a crack. Nia folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the purse as if returning a live wire. She didn't confront Ethan. She didn't text Maren. She smiled when Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind and asked, "You had a good night, right?" "Yes," she said, and surprised herself by how steady her voice sounded. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, Nia lay awake staring at the ceiling, her wrist resting on her chest, the bracelet heavy against her skin. It no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a question. And Nia Brooks had just begun to realize that some answers don't come gently. They arrive with a bill you never agreed to pay. From the outside, Nia Brooks's life looked composed, intentional, enviable. The kind of life people describe with words like impressive and inspiring, never stopping to ask what it cost to maintain. She woke before sunrise most days, scrolling through clinical trial reports while the city was still quiet, her mind already several steps ahead, regulatory risks, patient safety, timelines that could not slip. As director of clinical operations, mistakes were not an option. Every decision carried weight, sometimes lives. She was used to pressure. She thrived under it. What she didn't always admit, even to herself, was how tired she was. Ethan liked to say that was one of the things he loved about her. "Your drive," he'd tell her, usually with a smile, sometimes with a sigh. He admired her discipline the way someone admires a storm from behind glass, awed, but never inside it. Ethan Hale had built his career differently. He moved through rooms with ease, spoke in clean sentences that made investors nod, and never appeared rushed. He believed in leverage, in positioning, in knowing the right people and letting the rest fall into place. When they met 3 years earlier at a healthcare innovation summit, he had seemed like balance. Where she was sharp-edged and focused, he was smooth and reassuring. He knew how to make uncertainty sound temporary. He knew how to make her laugh when she hadn't realized she needed to. And Maren had been there from the beginning, watching it all unfold. Maren Vale entered Nia's life years before Ethan, back when both of them were still figuring out who they were allowed to become. They met at a professional women's networking event, two Black women navigating overwhelmingly white industries, exchanging knowing looks over cheap wine and polite conversation. Maren had been magnetic even then, confident, fast-talking, the kind of person who could turn a stranger into a connection in under 5 minutes. Where Nia worked in systems and safeguards, Maren worked in perception. She understood how stories traveled, how one sentence could elevate or destroy someone. She'd built her career on that skill, advising founders, executives, and public figures on what to say, when to say it, and what to never let slip. Maren didn't just manage reputations, she curated reality. The three of them became a unit without ever officially naming it. Dinners turned into traditions. Weekend plans overlapped. Conversations flowed easily, as if there were no boundaries that needed defending. Nia trusted Maren the way she trusted her own judgment. Ethan trusted Maren because Nia did. It felt natural. Too natural. In hindsight, there were moments, small, almost weightless, that didn't sit quite right. Maren's jokes that landed just a second too late, her smile holding an edge when people praised Nia's career. The way she'd say, "You really do have it all," as if it were an observation rather than a compliment. Ethan's habit of checking his phone when Maren spoke, his attention sharpening in ways Nia had never questioned. They told themselves they were just close, modern, secure enough not to be threatened by proximity. Nia believed that because she wanted to. She had worked too hard to build a life worth doubting it over discomfort. She told herself that trust was a choice, and she had chosen it deliberately. Over suspicion, over fear, over the exhausting habit of reading between lines. But perfection, she was learning, often depended on what people agreed not to look at. After her birthday, nothing visibly changed. Ethan still kissed her goodbye in the mornings. Maren still texted her heart emojis and inside jokes. Work still demanded everything Nia had to give. If anything, life seemed to smooth itself out, as if daring her to relax. And that was the most unsettling part. The credit card statement burned quietly in the back of her mind, not as an accusation, but as a reminder. She didn't bring it up. She didn't mention the bracelet. She watched instead, listened, cataloged. She noticed how Maren had begun suggesting plans that always included Ethan, never just the two of them like before. How Ethan spoke Maren's name with an ease that felt practiced. How conversations sometimes skipped ahead without her. References made that she didn't fully recognize. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, it formed a pattern too neat to ignore. Nia hated herself a little for noticing, for letting doubt seep into something she had once considered unbreakable. She told herself she was projecting stress, fatigue, insecurity. She reminded herself how ugly jealousy could be when left unchecked. Still, she began to understand something she hadn't before. The most dangerous lies weren't the dramatic ones. They were the ones that blended seamlessly into the truth. The ones everyone agreed to keep telling because they made life easier. 3 people, 1 story, too perfect. And perfection, Nia was starting to realize, often demanded a sacrifice. She just didn't yet know who was paying it. The first lie didn't arrive loudly. It didn't demand attention or announce itself with panic. It slipped into Nia Brooks's life disguised as convenience, wrapped in familiarity, and softened by the trust she had spent years carefully building. It was a Tuesday morning when she noticed it. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, coffee cooling beside him, scrolling through his phone with a faint crease between his brows. Nia watched from the doorway, half-dressed, her mind already split between an FDA call and a compliance review scheduled for noon. "I'm flying out Thursday," he said casually, without looking up. "Quick investor retreat, probably back Sunday." Nia paused. "Thursday?" she asked. "I thought your firm's quarterly meetings were next week." He glanced up then, just for a second. "They move things around. You know how it is." She nodded automatically. Of course she did. Schedules shifted. Plans evolved. This was Ethan's world. Fluid, fast, opaque by design. Still, something tightened in her chest. Later that day, between meetings, Nia pulled up her calendar. She kept everything there. Her life ran on structure because chaos demanded it. She scanned ahead, looking for the event Ethan had mentioned. Anything public, anything she might have missed. There was nothing. She closed the tab, irritation flickering. "You're overthinking," she told herself. She had patience depending on her focus. This wasn't worth the mental space. And yet, when Maren texted an hour later, "Dinner this week? Maybe all 3 of us?" Nia hesitated before replying. It hadn't always been like that. There was a time when Maren and Nia met weekly, just the 2 of them. No filters, no performances. They talked about ambition, exhaustion, the quiet fear of being replaceable. Somewhere along the way, those conversations had been replaced by group plans, shared tables, overlapping laughter. Nia hadn't noticed when it happened. She only noticed now, in its absence. That evening, while Ethan showered, Nia stood alone in the bedroom, holding the bracelet. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the clasp with her thumb. It was beautiful, undeniably so, heavy in a way that suggested intention, permanence. She tried to imagine Maren buying it herself, walking into the boutique, handing over her card, smiling at the total. The image didn't quite settle. Maren was generous, yes, but also careful, strategic. She talked often about cash flow realities and short-term liquidity. She joked about clients who lived beyond their means, who performed wealth instead of building it. $12,000 wasn't a joke. It was a statement. Nia slipped the bracelet back onto her wrist and caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked the same, composed, put together. But there was a new question in her eyes, one she didn't recognize. When Ethan emerged from the bathroom, hair damp, phone in hand, she forced a smile. "Hey," she said, "where's the retreat again?" Vancouver," he replied too quickly. "Just outside the city." "Nice," she said evenly. "Cold this time of year." "Yeah," he said, "I won't be gone long." He kissed her forehead and walked past, already typing a message. Nia watched him go, her mind replaying the exchange with a precision that surprised her. Vancouver? He hadn't said that before. Or had he? She sat on the edge of the bed, a familiar heaviness settling in her stomach. Not fear, not anger, something quieter. Recognition. The first lie is always small because it has to be. It needs to feel harmless enough to survive scrutiny, believable enough to blend into the truth. It relies on your generosity, on the benefit of the doubt you've given freely. Over the next few days, Nia began to notice more of them. Ethan stepping into the hallway to take calls he used to answer in front of her. Maren checking her phone mid-conversation, her fingers moving fast before she locked the screen and smiled too brightly. Plans changing last minute. Details that shifted just enough to make memory unreliable. Each instance alone meant nothing. Together they formed a rhythm. Nia hated that rhythm. She found herself replaying conversations in her head while reviewing lab data, catching herself watching reflections instead of faces, listening for what wasn't said. She told herself this was stress, burnout, the cost of responsibility. She reminded herself how dangerous suspicion could be if indulged without proof. But she also knew this. Systems failed not because of catastrophic errors, but because of small deviations no one thought worth correcting. The first lie is always small, and once you see it, you can never unsee the space it creates, wide enough for everything else to slip through. Nia Brooks had built her career on one simple belief. Data never lied. People did, often unintentionally, but systems, when read correctly, always told the truth. That belief had kept patients safe, prevented lawsuits, and saved her from more than one catastrophic decision. It was the reason she trusted evidence over instinct, even when instinct screamed first. So she stopped listening to feelings and started looking at facts. It began with something small, almost laughable, a delivery notification. On Thursday afternoon, while reviewing protocol deviations in her office, Nia's phone buzzed with a building app alert. Someone downstairs had received a package that required a signature. She barely glanced at it. Then hours later, another alert came through. Same courier, different unit. Nia frowned. Her building wasn't large, and high-value deliveries were rare enough that they stood out. She searched her notifications. Nothing addressed to her. Nothing addressed to Ethan. That shouldn't have mattered, except the bracelet hadn't arrived by magic. Someone had signed for it, somewhere. That evening, while Ethan packed for his Vancouver trip, Nia leaned casually against the doorway. "Hey," she said, keeping her tone light. "Do you remember if anything got delivered here last week? A package I might have missed?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "No. Why?" "No reason," she said, smiling. "Just thought I'd ask." He went back to folding his shirts. The conversation ended there. Too clean, too easy. Later, after he'd left for the airport, Nia opened her laptop and logged into the building portal. She wasn't hacking. She had resident access. Delivery logs were visible to all tenants. She scrolled back through the week of her birthday. No entries matched Ethan's name. None matched her unit. She sat back in her chair, the room suddenly very quiet. If the bracelet hadn't come here, then where had it gone? The next step was the jeweler. Nia didn't call pretending to be someone she wasn't. She didn't ask questions she wasn't entitled to. She emailed customer support from her personal account, explaining that she'd received a gift and wanted to confirm care instructions and warranty registration. It was a common request, harmless. The reply came the next morning. They thanked her for her purchase and attached general care guidelines. But at the bottom of the email, in smaller print, was a line she hadn't expected. For delivery-related inquiries, please reference the original shipping address on file. Nia stared at the sentence for a long time. Original shipping address. So there was one. And it wasn't hers. She closed the email and opened her calendar. Ethan's trip. Vancouver. She searched flights, schedules, conferences, retreats. Nothing public aligned with his dates. That didn't prove anything, but it added weight. Then there was Marin. Nia scrolled through their recent messages. Invitations, emojis, reassurances. Miss you. We need to catch up. But always with an addition now. Ethan, too. As if proximity itself were proof of transparency. That night, Nia did something she hadn't done in years. She drove. No destination at first, just motion. Seattle at night was a patchwork of light and shadow, streets curving toward people pretended were permanent. She found herself downtown, near the waterfront, watching reflections ripple and distort in the dark glass of closed storefronts. She thought about maps. Maps were supposed to guide you, show you where you were, show you how to get where you were going. But they only worked if the terrain was honest, if roads didn't disappear without warning, if landmarks meant what they claimed to mean. Her life had felt mapped, stable, predictable. Now, pieces no longer aligned. The delivery logs didn't match the gift. The trip didn't match the calendar. The closeness didn't match the ease it pretended to have. At a red light, Nia's phone buzzed. A message from Marin. Random question, it read. What neighborhood are you guys in again? I always forget. Nia stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Marin had been to her apartment dozens of times. She knew the answer. Nia typed back slowly. Capitol Hill. Why? A few seconds passed. Then, just curious, talking about moving. You know me, always thinking ahead. The light turned green. Nia didn't move. Curiosity, she thought, was rarely random. When she got home, she poured herself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter, looking at the bracelet resting against her skin. It caught the light just right, flawless and deliberate, a circle with no beginning or end. But now she could see it clearly. This wasn't a gift that had found its way to her. It was a gift that had been rerouted. And somewhere in the city there was a place, an address, a door, a signature that knew more about the truth than anyone in her apartment ever had. The map didn't match the story, and Nia Brooks was done pretending it did. Nia didn't sleep that night. She lay on her back, eyes open, listening to the city breathe around her. Cars hissing on wet pavement, a siren fading somewhere toward the sound. Sleep felt like a betrayal of its own, a surrender to uncertainty. So when dawn came, she was already awake, already moving. She started where facts lived. Public records were not secrets. They were simply truths no one expected you to read. With a cup of coffee cooling beside her laptop, Nia searched property listings, then rental registries, then business filings. It took longer than she expected, not because the information was hidden, but because it was intentionally unremarkable. Clean, professional, designed to blend. She found it just after 8. A one-bedroom condo in a converted warehouse near the waterfront. Modern, quiet, expensive without being flashy. The kind of place someone rented when they didn't want to be noticed. The lease wasn't in an individual's name. It belonged to a limited liability company. VLR Strategies, LLC. Nia froze. She knew that name. Marin had mentioned it once, casually, over drinks months ago. A side entity, she'd said, rolling her eyes. A consulting vehicle for certain clients who wanted discretion. You know how it is, Marin had laughed. Sometimes people pay for silence. At the time, Nia had admired the ingenuity. Now, her stomach turned. She clicked deeper. The LLC had been formed less than a year ago. Registered address, a virtual office downtown. No website, no public-facing work. Just enough structure to look legitimate. Just enough to disappear behind if needed. Nia leaned back in her chair, the weight of the realization pressing into her chest. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't messy. This was considered, planned. the kind of arrangement built by people who understood how to hide in plain sight. She thought of Marin's jokes about money, about clients who didn't pay on time, about how exhausting it was to keep up appearances in an industry that rewarded illusion. She remembered the edge beneath Marin's humor lately, the subtle defensiveness when success stories weren't hers. Envy didn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looked like proximity. Nia closed her laptop and stared at the wall, the room feeling suddenly smaller. The apartment that shouldn't exist, wasn't just a location. It was a decision, a space carved out of lies and logistics, paid for with intent. Her phone buzzed. A notification from her bank app. Routine, automatic. She almost ignored it. Then she saw the merchant name and felt a jolt of cold clarity. A parking garage near the waterfront. She opened the details. The charge was from 3 days earlier. Mid-afternoon, Ethan had told her he'd been in meetings all day. Back-to-back calls. No breaks. Nia swallowed. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She needed to be sure, not emotionally sure, but structurally certain. She needed to understand the shape of what she was standing inside. That afternoon, she took a different route home. She didn't tell herself where she was going until she was already there. The building was quieter than she expected. No doorman, no grand entrance, just a clean lobby, neutral art, the kind of place that prided itself on discretion. Nia stood across the street, heart pounding, watching residents come and go. Young professionals, couples, no one who looked like trouble, no one who looked like a secret. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to. Just knowing it was real, that the address existed, that the space had been paid for, that someone had signed a lease with the intention of keeping it separate from the life she knew. That was enough. On her drive home, a memory surfaced uninvited. Marin, months ago, raising her glass and saying, half joking, half serious, "You ever notice how some people just glide through life? Doors open, opportunities fall into their laps. Makes you wonder what the rest of us are doing wrong." Nia had laughed then, reached for reassurance. "You're brilliant," she'd said. "You'll always land on your feet." Had that been the moment something shifted? Or had it happened long before, quietly, while Nia was busy building a future she thought they all shared? When she got home, Ethan wasn't there yet. His suitcase stood by the door, a familiar sight that now felt like a prop. Nia walked past it without touching it and went into the bedroom. She removed the bracelet and set it on the dresser. For the first time, she didn't see beauty. She saw logistics, an invoice, a delivery route, a signature she hadn't written. This wasn't a mistake born of passion. It was a system. And systems, Nia knew, always left traces. Somewhere between the condo that shouldn't exist and the life that no longer made sense, Nia Brooks crossed an invisible line. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was mapping. Nia understood thresholds. In her work, there were lines you did not cross, not because you couldn't, but because once you did, the outcome stopped being controllable. Evidence mishandled was evidence wasted. Truth discovered the wrong way could collapse under its own weight. So she waited. She waited the way she had learned to wait in clinical trials. Patient, precise, alert to windows that opened briefly and without warning. She did not touch Ethan's phone. She did not guess passwords. She did not follow impulses that would leave fingerprints. Instead, she paid attention to habits. Ethan left his laptop on the dining table most evenings, angled just enough toward the couch that she could see the glow of the screen from the hallway. He trusted familiarity. He trusted routine. He trusted that the woman who shared his bed would never look. On Sunday afternoon, the window opened. Ethan had stepped out to take a call, pacing the balcony with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low, controlled. Nia moved through the apartment on instinct alone, slow, quiet, deliberate. When she reached the table, she saw it immediately. An open browser tab, not a homepage, not an inbox, a receipt. Her pulse surged, then steadied. Training kicked in. She didn't touch the trackpad. She didn't scroll. She stood exactly where she was and read what was already visible. Merchant. Oraline fine jewelry. Item. Bracelet. Limited series. Status. Delivered. Delivered. Nia's mouth went dry. She sat down, careful not to jostle the table, and moved the cursor just enough to wake the screen fully. The page refreshed with agonizing slowness, as if time itself were resisting what came next. Then the details loaded. Her eyes went first to the total, $12,480. Then to the date, 3 days before her birthday, the confirmation number, the method of payment, and then the line that made the room tilt. Delivery address, Pierstone Lofts, Unit 4B, Seattle, Washington. Her breath caught. Pierstone Lofts, the warehouse conversion near the waterfront. The building she had stood across from 2 days earlier, convincing herself she didn't need to go inside. The apartment that shouldn't exist. Nia felt a strange calm settle over her, heavy and clarifying. This was no longer suspicion, it was structure. The story was assembling itself piece by piece, each element fitting too cleanly to deny. She glanced toward the balcony. Ethan was still talking, his back turned. She had minutes, maybe less. She scanned the page again, this time slower. At the bottom, beneath the warranty information, was a contact email associated with the order. It wasn't Ethan's work address. It wasn't his personal one either. It was something else entirely. A Gmail account with a neutral name. No identifiers. No history she could see from here. A second life required a second inbox. Nia felt a flare of heat behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet, but pressure. She wanted to open it, to click, to search, to pull the thread until everything unraveled. But she didn't. Not yet. She took out her phone and did what she did best. She documented without touching. Date, time, what was visible, what was not. She memorized the confirmation number, the unit, the email handle. She noted what she could later corroborate without violating anything. When Ethan came back inside, the laptop was exactly as he'd left it. Nia stood at the sink, rinsing a glass that didn't need cleaning. "You good?" he asked, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Yeah," she said, "just tired." That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Nia lay awake again, the ceiling unfamiliar above her. She replayed the scene over and over, testing it for weakness. There was none. The email existed, the address existed, the system held, but something else did too, a deeper unease. Because the email hadn't just been hidden, it had been separate, deliberate, built to operate alongside his real life without ever touching it. That kind of division required practice. It required intent, and intent was not an accident. The next morning, while Ethan showered, Nia opened her laptop and did what she'd avoided for days. She searched the email handle, not in inboxes, not in accounts she didn't own, but across the open web. Forums, cached pages, data breaches, anything public. It took less than 5 minutes. The email had been used before. Not often, but enough. One hit surfaced from an event registration page months back, a private networking dinner tied to a healthcare conference in San Diego. The name associated with the registration wasn't Ethan's. It was Marin Vale. Nia closed the laptop and sat very still. This was the moment people later described as shock. The instant where everything shattered. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like confirmation. Like the quiet click of a lock sliding into place. The email that wasn't supposed to be there wasn't just proof of an affair. It was proof of coordination. And suddenly, Nia understood the most dangerous truth of all. She hadn't stumbled into a betrayal born of impulse. She had been living inside a system designed to exclude her. Nia waited 3 days before she looked again. Not because she needed courage, but because she needed control. What she had seen already was enough to end a relationship, enough to walk away with dignity and never look back. But endings without understanding had a way of haunting you. They left questions that returned in quiet moments, sharpening over time. So she waited until she could look without flinching. The opportunity came on a gray Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that flattened the city into muted tones. Ethan had left early for a partner strategy session. His laptop sat open on the dining table, charging, a soft hum filling the apartment. The browser was still active, the receipt page long gone. What remained was worse. Nia sat down slowly, as if sudden movement might alert someone who wasn't there. Her hands were steady now. Whatever shock she'd had already burned through her system, leaving something colder behind. She opened the email account. There was no dramatic flood of messages, no obvious archive labeled affair or do not open, just a sparse inbox, curated with the same restraint Ethan applied to everything else. Most emails had been deleted. Some threads were half cleared, replies missing, dates spaced out just enough to suggest caution. But one thread remained. It was short, too short. The subject line read simply, "Dinner." Nia clicked. The first message was dated 8 months earlier. "I didn't expect that to happen," Ethan had written, "but I can't stop thinking about it." She felt her chest tighten, not from surprise, but from the casualness of it, as if what had happened were a spill, an accident, something unavoidable. The reply came minutes later. "Neither did I," Marin wrote, "but let's not pretend we didn't see it coming." Nia closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. She forced herself to keep reading. The messages were careful at first, sparse, acknowledging boundaries even as they stepped over them. They talked about timing, about discretion, about how complicated things were, how unfair it would be to blow everything up. Then, gradually, the language shifted. Meetings became excuses. Trips became opportunities. The restraint faded, replaced by familiarity so complete it was almost arrogant. They joked about close calls, about how easy it was to reroute schedules, about how trusting Nia was. That was when the nausea hit. Nia stood abruptly, barely making it to the bathroom before the room tilted. She vomited hard, violently, as if her body were trying to purge something it had carried too long. When it passed, she sat on the floor, back against the tub, shaking, not with tears, but with rage held so tightly it hurt. 8 months. 8 months of mornings she'd rushed to work thinking she was building a future with someone who had already chosen another life. 8 months of dinners where Marin had looked her in the eye and asked about her stress levels, her workload, her relationship, gathering information like inventory. She went back to the laptop. Further down the thread were logistics, hotels, flights, calendar overlaps. The precision of it was chilling. There was no chaos here, no emotional recklessness. This was coordination. And then there were the messages about her. "She didn't suspect a thing," Marin wrote after the birthday. "Her face when I gave her the bracelet, I thought she might cry." "Did she?" Ethan replied. "Yeah, a little. God, it was almost uncomfortable." "Almost," Ethan answered. "But she'll be fine. She's always fine." Nia stared at the words until they blurred. This wasn't just betrayal. It was contempt. She scrolled once more and found a photo embedded near the end of the thread. Marin on a balcony, hair loose, city lights behind her. Ethan's reflection faint in the glass. The timestamp matched a weekend he told Nia he was in Toronto meeting potential investors. She remembered that weekend clearly. She'd worked late both nights, eating takeout alone, texting him updates about a patient trial that had nearly gone wrong. He'd replied with encouragement, with heart emojis. She closed the laptop. For a long time, Nia sat on the floor of her living room, her back against the couch, staring at nothing. The apartment felt foreign now, as if the walls had absorbed a version of her life she no longer recognized. This was the moment people expected her to cry, to collapse, to call someone and scream into the phone. She did none of that. Instead, something inside her went very still. The pain was there, vast and consuming, but beneath it was something sharper. Clarity, the kind that came when illusions burned away completely, leaving only structure behind. 8 months in one thread had told her everything she needed to know. Not just who they were, but who she could no longer afford to be. Understanding betrayal didn't lessen its sting, but it did sharpen it. After the thread, after the messages and the dates, and the casual cruelty laid bare in plain text, Naya expected to feel consumed by grief. Instead, she felt something colder and more dangerous: curiosity. Not the soft kind, but the kind that asked why with surgical focus. Because affairs happened every day. People crossed lines, made reckless choices, imploded their own lives. But this had structure, discipline, planning. This wasn't desire alone. This was motive. Nia began to reconstruct Marinvale's life the same way she reconstructed failed systems at work, by tracing stress points. She didn't stalk. She didn't pry into private accounts. She followed public signals, the kind professionals left behind without realizing how clearly they spoke. Marin's client list had thinned. Once, Marin had bragged about being booked solid, juggling founders and executives who needed her words more than oxygen. Lately, her calendar had been strangely open. Last-minute dinners, midday coffees, sudden availability she'd tried to frame as finally slowing down. But success didn't slow down quietly. It announced itself. It left evidence. Then there were the lawsuits. Not public judgments, yet, but filings, threats, mediation requests tucked into legal databases most people never searched. A former client alleging misrepresentation, another claiming reputational damage. Nothing proven, nothing resolved. Just enough to bleed money and time. Debt didn't always look like desperation. Sometimes it wore designer coats and perfect hair. Nia remembered Marin's recent jokes, how often she'd laughed about cash flow, how she'd mocked influencers who pretended to be richer than they were. The jokes had always landed with a bite. Now Nia understood why. Marin wasn't joking. She was confessing. And then there was Ethan. Nia had once believed Marin admired Ethan because he treated Nia well, because he supported her career, because he fit neatly into the future they'd imagined. That belief felt naive now. Ethan wasn't just a man. He was access. He moved money. He controlled introductions. He decided who got a meeting and who stayed invisible. For someone like Marin, whose power depended entirely on proximity to power, Ethan wasn't temptation. He was opportunity. Nia replayed old conversations in her mind, hearing them differently now. Marin asking, "Does Ethan handle all his own investments?" Marin wondering aloud, "Do his partners ever need PR support?" Marin laughing when Nia brushed it off, saying, "Just curious." Curiosity again. Only this time, it wasn't innocent. Marin had always wanted to win. Not in the obvious way, not trophies or applause, but in comparison. She measured herself against others quietly, obsessively. And Nia, without trying, had become the metric. Nia had stability, respect, a career built on competence, not charisma. She didn't need to perform success because her work spoke for her. In rooms where Marin sold narratives, Nia delivered outcomes. That kind of success was infuriating to someone who believed everything had to be fought for, taken, secured before someone else claimed it first. So Marin didn't steal Nia's job. She didn't sabotage her work. She went for the one thing Nia had allowed herself to trust without armor: love. But Marin hadn't acted alone. Ethan's role was just as damning. Nia saw him clearly now, not as a victim of seduction, not as a man caught in a moment of weakness, but as someone who made repeated, calculated choices. He knew exactly what he was doing when he created a second email address, when he rented a private apartment through an LLC, when he paid for silence disguised as generosity. He hadn't been careless. He'd been confident. Confident that Nia was too busy, too disciplined, too reasonable to question him. Confident that Marin would manage the narrative if anything slipped. Confident that the world would continue to see him as trustworthy because that was the role he played best. And that, more than the sex, more than the lies, was what made Nia's hands shake. They hadn't just betrayed her, they had underestimated her. The motive was no longer abstract. It was envy sharpened by debt. ambition poisoned by insecurity, and a shared belief that winning mattered more than integrity. Nia closed her laptop and sat back, letting the full shape of it settle. This wasn't a tragedy of passion. It was a transaction. And transactions, she knew, always left receipts. Nia Brooks had told herself she would be careful, measured, silent, invisible. She had told herself that knowledge was power only if you knew how to hold it. And for the most part, she did. But even the most disciplined people make mistakes, not because they are careless, but because they are human. Because pain, when carried too long without release, looks for a crack. Nia's mistake was not dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or an accusation or a tearful phone call in the middle of the night. It was a question. They were having coffee, just the two of them, the way they used to. Marin had insisted on it, just us, like old times. She'd said it with a smile that felt rehearsed, as if nostalgia itself were a tool she knew how to deploy. They sat near the window of a quiet cafe downtown. Rain streaked the glass. Seattle at its most convincingly innocent. Marin talked easily, filling the space with updates Nia hadn't asked for. A potential new client, a branding pitch that might finally turn things around. She laughed too loudly at her own jokes, watched Nia's face too closely for reactions. Nia listened, waited. Then, carefully, she asked, "Do you still live in Capitol Hill?" The question was simple, casual, almost lazy. Marin didn't answer right away. It was just a pause, a fraction of a second. But Nia felt it like a muscle twitch. Marin lifted her cup, took a sip, set it down. Her smile never left her face, but it tightened at the corners. "Mostly," she said. "Why?" "Just curious," Nia replied, matching the tone. "You've been bouncing around a lot lately." Marin laughed. "Occupational hazard. You know how it is." But her eyes didn't laugh. They sharpened. From that moment on, the energy shifted. Marin became warmer, more attentive. She leaned in, touched Nia's arm when she spoke, peppered the conversation with affection. It was too much. Like someone overcorrecting after a slip. Nia recognized the tactic instantly. Damage control. That night, Ethan came home later than usual. He kissed Nia's cheek, asked about her day, then mentioned, almost offhandedly, that his Vancouver trip might be a little shorter than expected. A revision. The next morning, he deleted a calendar entry while standing at the kitchen counter, his back half-turned, blocking the screen without seeming to notice he was doing it. The system had reacted. Nia lay awake that night, anger burning low and steady beneath her ribs. Not at them, at herself. She had tipped the board, just enough for them to know she was no longer asleep. She replayed the cafe moment over and over, dissecting it with professional cruelty. The timing, the phrasing, the look in Marin's eyes. She hadn't revealed anything concrete, but she'd revealed awareness. In her world, that was enough to trigger protocol. People who live by image and leverage didn't wait to be exposed. They moved first. They rewrote stories. They preempted narratives. They framed the truth before anyone else could. Nia understood now what she'd risked. If Marin decided to paint her as unstable, jealous, overworked, if Ethan decided to seed doubt quietly among friends, colleagues, investors, Nia could find herself defending not just her heart, but her credibility. And credibility, once cracked, never healed cleanly. The realization settled like ice in her veins. She had one advantage left: timing. They didn't know how much she knew, only that she knew something. That meant they would adjust, not flee. They would tighten control, not disappear, which meant they would make mistakes of their own. Nia stood in the bathroom the next morning, staring at her reflection. Her face looked calm, professional, untouched, but her eyes were different now, sharper, darker, resolved. She spoke to herself quietly, the way she did before difficult board meetings. No more improvising. She would not ask questions she didn't already know the answers to. She would not give them emotional access. She would not underestimate how far people went when they believed they were entitled to win. Her mistake had been small, but it had taught her something essential. From this point on, Nia Brooks would move like someone who understood the stakes, and she would not make the same mistake twice. After the mistake, Nia did something she had been trained to do in moments of crisis. She slowed down, not because the danger had passed, but because haste was how systems failed. Emotion rushed decisions. Assumptions collapsed cases. If she was going to move forward, she would do it the only way she trusted, cleanly, deliberately, and without leaving room for reversal. She stopped watching them. No more scanning Ethan's phone. No more reading meaning into Marin's tone. Surveillance invited reaction, and reaction was what they were waiting for. Instead, Nia turned her attention inward, to process, to protection, to structure. She took a personal day from work and sat in her car outside a small law office she'd been referred to years earlier during a compliance scare. She didn't park directly in front. She didn't walk in with drama. She waited until her breathing slowed, until her hands stopped shaking, and then she went inside. The attorney was not surprised by her story. That, more than anything, unsettled her. He listened without interruption, asked questions that cut straight to the bone, and nodded at moments where Nia had expected disbelief. "You're not asking how to hurt them," he said finally. "You're asking how not to hurt yourself." "Yes," Nia replied. "Exactly that." He leaned back in his chair. "Then you need to separate truth from exposure. Truth is neutral. Exposure is emotional. One protects you, the other creates risk." They talked about boundaries, about what evidence was legally obtained and what wasn't, about documentation versus dissemination, about the difference between informing and accusing. "You don't need to prove an affair," he told her. "You need to show patterns of poor judgment that intersect with professional trust. That's where consequences exist." That night, Nia went home and began building what she thought of as a fact spine. No commentary, no interpretation, just dates, times, locations, financial records that were hers to reference, public filings, event registrations, and observable inconsistencies. She removed adjectives. She stripped emotion. She treated her own heartbreak like a data set. The affair receded into the background, not erased, but reframed. It was no longer the center of the story. It was context. At work, she continued as usual, led meetings, reviewed reports, took calls. No one noticed a change, and that was the point. Stability was camouflage. At home, she became quieter, more contained. Ethan noticed, of course. He asked if she was tired, if work was too much, if she wanted to get away for a weekend. She smiled and said, "Maybe later." Marin texted more frequently, checked in, sent photos, shared articles about friendship and loyalty that would have felt ironic if they hadn't been so carefully chosen. Nia responded just enough to remain familiar. She understood now that this wasn't about revenge. Revenge burned hot and brief, leaving ash behind. This was about consequence, the kind that unfolded slowly, invisibly, and could not be traced back to her without speculation. Truth that couldn't hurt her back. She identified the pressure points without touching them yet. Ethan's reliance on trust-based relationships. Marin's dependence on reputation and discretion. Both operated in ecosystems where whispers traveled faster than proof. But proof, when it appeared, never needed to shout. Nia also confronted herself in ways she hadn't expected. She acknowledged the role exhaustion had played, how badly she'd wanted peace, how often she'd dismissed discomfort as weakness. She wrote these things down, not as self-punishment, but as inventory. Because if she was honest, truly honest, part of her had benefited from not looking too closely. Trust had been easier than vigilance. Love had been simpler than doubt. That realization hurt more than anything else. But it also freed her. When you accept your own blind spots, you stop fearing other people's manipulations. You stop needing to be perfect. You focus instead on being precise. By the end of the week, Nia had her strategy. No public scenes. No anonymous attacks. No emotional disclosures that could be reframed. Only verified facts, shared selectively, with people who had something to lose by ignoring them. She looked around the apartment one evening, at the shared furniture, the shared space, the shared life that was already dissolving beneath her feet. Ethan was laughing on the phone in the other room, confident, unaware. Nia closed her laptop and stood, a calm settling over her that felt unfamiliar and steady. This wasn't about destroying them. It was about stepping out of the story they thought they were writing and ensuring that when the truth emerged, it would stand on its own, unassailable and irreversible. The first consequence didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no instant collapses. It arrived the way real damage often did, quietly, politely, behind closed doors. Nia chose her moment carefully. The biotech fundraising gala had been on the calendar for months, a polished affair meant to celebrate innovation and reassure capital that everything was under control. Investors, founders, regulators, people who believed order could be engineered if the right minds sat at the table. Ethan had been excited about it. He'd mentioned it more than once, framing it as a visibility opportunity, a place where relationships were renewed, where trust was reinforced with handshakes and champagne. Nia understood that world now. She didn't attend as Ethan's partner. She didn't attend as a betrayed woman looking for vindication. She attended as herself, director of clinical operations, known for rigor, discretion, and a refusal to exaggerate. Her presence alone carried credibility. The conversations began innocently enough. She ran into David Klein, an angel investor who had backed two of Ethan's firm's recent healthcare plays. They exchanged pleasantries, talked about trial timelines, regulatory bottlenecks, the usual safe terrain. Then David leaned in, lowering his voice slightly. "I hear Ethan's firm is circling another medtech acquisition," he said. "You must have opinions." Nia paused, just long enough to be deliberate. "I do," she said evenly, "but I'd urge caution." David's eyebrows lifted. "In what sense?" She didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. She framed it as professional concern, the way she'd learned to in boardrooms where words carried consequences. "I've become aware of some judgment issues," she said. "Nothing illegal, but enough to raise questions about discretion and conflicts of interest, particularly where personal relationships intersect with deal flow." She let the sentence hang. No names, no details yet. David studied her face, searching for motive. He found none. That was the point. "I'm saying this because I respect you," Nia continued, "and because I'd want someone to tell me." David nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." They parted shortly after, the conversation unfinished in the way the most effective ones always were. Nia had similar exchanges that evening, with a venture partner here, a limited partner there, always the same tone, calm, measured, unemotional. She spoke like someone who had nothing to gain from exaggeration and everything to lose from being wrong. By the time she left the gala, she hadn't raised her voice once, but she had planted doubt. The effect was almost immediate. Over the next few days, Nia noticed the shift, not because anyone announced it, but because the rhythm changed. Ethan came home irritated in ways he hadn't before. He checked his phone more often, frowned at emails he didn't share. He stopped mentioning meetings by name, referring to them vaguely instead. One evening, he tossed his phone onto the couch with more force than necessary. "People are being weird," he muttered. Nia looked up from her laptop. "Weird how?" "Non-committal," he said, dragging their feet, asking questions they've never asked before. She nodded, nonchalant. "That happens." He glanced at her, searching her face for something. Sympathy, reassurance, maybe confirmation that the ground beneath him was still solid. She gave him none of it. A week later, Nia attended a smaller industry mixer, one she almost skipped. She stood near the bar, nursing a glass of sparkling water, listening more than she spoke. That was when she heard it. Two men in tailored suits, voices low. "I'm not saying anything's wrong," one said. I'm just saying I'm waiting. Same, the other replied. No rush. No new commitments until we have clarity. About Hale? A pause. About judgment, the second man said carefully. Nia turned away before they noticed her. That was the moment she understood. The first consequence had landed. Not as punishment, as hesitation. In Ethan's world, hesitation was lethal. Deals didn't die because of scandal. They died because confidence evaporated, because someone, somewhere, decided to wait. And waiting spread like a contagion. That night, Ethan paced the apartment, frustration leaking through his usual composure. I don't get it, he said. Nothing's changed. Nia watched him quietly. Everything had changed. He just hadn't been told yet. The silence from investors grew louder by the day. Meetings postponed, calls unanswered, interest expressed and then withdrawn without explanation. No accusations, no explanations, just distance. And distance, Nia knew, was how power signaled disapproval without ever getting its hands dirty. She went to bed that night with a strange, hollow calm in her chest. There was no satisfaction in it, no joy, only confirmation. The truth, when released correctly, didn't explode. It echoed. And in the echo, people began to step away. Maren Vale had always understood rooms. She knew how to enter them, where to stand, who to greet first, how long to linger before moving on. She knew when to laugh, when to listen, when to lean in close and lower her voice just enough to suggest intimacy without obligation. Rooms were her element. They were where she performed best. That was why she noticed immediately when the room began to turn on her. It started subtly. Invitations that arrived late or not at all. Replies that used to come within minutes now took days, if they came at all. A designer she'd worked with for years suddenly went in a different direction. A journalist she once texted freely now responded through an assistant with clipped politeness. Maren told herself it was a slow month. The industry was fickle. People were distracted. She'd seen cycles like this before. But this felt different. Nia didn't watch it happen directly. She didn't need to. She heard about it the way truth often traveled, indirectly, through tone rather than content. A colleague at work mentioned, offhandedly, that a certain PR strategist had been quietly dropped from an upcoming campaign due to internal concerns. At a networking breakfast, someone joked about communications people who forgot which side of discretion they were on. The words were vague, the meaning wasn't. Marin's world depended on one thing above all else: trust. The assumption that what you said to her would stay with her, that what she knew wouldn't be leveraged against you unless you wanted it to be, that your reputation was safe in her hands. Once that assumption cracked, everything else followed. The first public sign came at a panel discussion on brand ethics, a painfully ironic setting. Maren sat on stage beside two other speakers, her posture immaculate, her expression composed. She spoke fluently, as always, about narrative integrity and professional boundaries. But the audience wasn't leaning in. During the Q&A, a young founder stood up and asked, "How do you balance advocacy for clients with personal relationships that might influence your advice?" It was a fair question, abstract, clean. Marin smiled, launched into her answer, and felt it fall flat. Not because it was wrong, but because no one was convinced. Heads tilted, eyes flicked sideways, phones came out, not to record her brilliance, but to message someone else. She finished to polite applause that sounded thin even to her own ears. Afterward, the room emptied faster than usual. People she expected to approach her didn't. Conversations formed just out of her reach, circles closing before she could step into them. For the first time in years, Maren stood alone at an event meant to showcase her expertise. She felt it then. Not humiliation, yet. Fear. Behind the scenes, consequences compounded. A professional association emailed requesting clarification on a complaint. A potential client asked pointed questions about. Marin tried to trace the source. She replayed recent interactions, searching for the leak. Her mind circled back, again and again, to Nia. The realization came late one night, sitting alone in the waterfront apartment she had once considered a victory. The place felt colder now, empty in a way it hadn't before. She scrolled through her contacts, counting the number of people she could call who would answer without hesitation. The number was smaller than she expected. She drafted a message to Nia and deleted it, drafted another, deleted that too. Pride warred with panic, anger with regret. She told herself Nia couldn't have done this. Nia was too careful, too ethical, too good. But goodness, Maren was learning, didn't mean passivity. At a private industry dinner a week later, the shift became undeniable. Maren entered late, as she often did, expecting the familiar lift of attention. Instead, conversations paused and then resumed without her. A seat she assumed was saved had been given away. When she spoke, people listened politely and then turned elsewhere. She had lost the room. Not with a scandal, not with a public takedown, but with whispers, with hesitation, with the slow, irreversible erosion of confidence. Marin left early, her heels clicking too loudly against the floor, her smile fixed until the door closed behind her. In the elevator, alone, the mask finally slipped. This wasn't an attack she could spin. There was no headline to refute, no accusation to deny, just an absence where certainty used to be, just a sense that people were choosing not to stand too close to her anymore. And that was the cruelest consequence of all. Because Marin Vale didn't need applause. She needed access. And access, once withdrawn, never returned quietly. Somewhere across the city, Nia Brooks was living her life as usual. Working, sleeping, breathing, holding herself together. She wasn't watching Maren fall. She wasn't celebrating. But the system was working. And Maren, for the first time, understood what it felt like to be on the outside of a story she could no longer control. Nia did not plan the reveal like a confrontation. She planned it like an ending. The gala unfolded exactly as expected. White tablecloths, low music, practiced laughter drifting through the room like perfume. This was Ethan's element, a space where he felt tall, untouchable, wrapped in the quiet affirmation of people who believed in his judgment because they had always been given reason to. He spotted Nia across the room and smiled, relief flickering briefly across his face. She had dressed simply, no statement jewelry, no armor, just composure. "Hey," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "I didn't know you were coming tonight." "I decided last minute," she replied. Her voice was steady, neutral. "Can we talk for a moment?" He hesitated, only a fraction of a second, but nodded. Of course. They didn't go somewhere dramatic. No balcony, no empty hallway, just a quiet corner near the edge of the room, close enough to the crowd that raising voices would be noticed, far enough that privacy remained intact. Nia reached into her clutch and removed a slim envelope. "I'm not here to argue," she said calmly. "I'm not here to ask questions. I already have the answers." Ethan frowned, confusion sliding quickly into something tighter. "Nia, what is this?" "It's a timeline," she said. "Dates, locations, financial records, event registrations. Everything that overlaps where it shouldn't." She handed him the envelope. He didn't open it at first. He searched her face instead, as if looking for emotion he could respond to. Anger, pain, desperation. There was none. Finally, he opened it. Nia watched his expression change, not explosively, but subtly. The way it did when a deal fell apart in slow motion. When confidence drained not through shock, but through recognition. "You went through my things," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "I observed patterns, and I confirmed facts that were visible without trespassing." His jaw tightened. "This isn't what it looks like." That sentence only works when the person hearing it doesn't already know the truth, she said. "I do." He exhaled, a long breath meant to steady himself. "Okay, let's talk about this at home." "There is no home," Nia said gently. Not anymore. She let that settle before continuing. I didn't expose your affair, she said. I didn't need to. I flagged concerns about judgment, about discretion, about blurred boundaries that create risk, especially in industries built on trust. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. You talked to people? I spoke carefully, Nia said, and honestly. You had no right. I had every right, she interrupted, her voice still calm, to protect myself from being collateral damage. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware of it again, of the laughter, the clinking glasses, the people who had begun to pass him by without stopping. You're ruining my career, he whispered. Nia shook her head. No, I removed myself from the story you were telling about who you are. The rest is just gravity. For a moment, he looked genuinely panicked. We can fix this, he said. We can talk. I made a mistake. You made a choice, she replied. Over and over. For 8 months, she stepped back, creating distance between them that felt permanent. I won't raise my voice, she said. I won't embarrass you. That's not who I am. But understand this. I will not protect you anymore. He reached for her arm. She moved out of reach effortlessly. I know about Marin, he said quickly. I know she's been struggling. We didn't mean for it to. Stop, Nia said, and this time there was steel in it. Do not turn this into a shared burden. What you did because you believed I wouldn't see it. Or if I did, I'd forgive it. She met his eyes fully now. You were wrong. She turned and walked back into the room. As she passed through the crowd, something subtle happened. Conversations faltered. Eyes followed her. Someone nodded to her with quiet respect. Someone else turned away from Ethan entirely. She didn't look back. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp. Nia inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the last months shift. Not gone, but redistributed. The truth had been delivered, not as a spectacle, but as a verdict. And verdicts, once spoken, did not require applause. They simply stood. The aftermath did not explode. It receded. Ethan did not beg in public. He did not send dramatic messages or show up at her office. He tried something far quieter, far more dangerous, normalcy. As if by refusing to acknowledge the rupture, he could reverse it. The night after the gala, Nia returned to the apartment alone. She stood in the doorway for a long time, keys still in her hand, listening to the unfamiliar silence. The space looked the same. The couch, the shelves, the framed photos that now felt like evidence from another life. She didn't cry then. She moved methodically, opened the bedroom closet, removed Ethan's suits from the hangers, and laid them carefully on the bed. Folded his shirts, placed his shoes side by side. Not out of kindness, but out of closure. Precision was how she kept herself intact. When Ethan came home hours later, he froze at the sight. You can't do this, he said, his voice breaking through the quiet. Not like this. This is the only way I can, Nia replied. He tried arguments first, then apologies, then history. He reminded her of trips they'd planned, of jokes only they shared, of the version of himself he thought she still loved. Nia listened without interrupt. When he was done, she said, I don't doubt that you feel regret, but regret isn't repair. She asked him to leave. He called her the next morning, and the next, then sent long messages she didn't read. When he finally realized she wasn't responding, his tone shifted. Less pleading, more wounded. As if her refusal to engage was a betrayal of its own. Nia blocked his number. Marin was harder. She appeared at Nia's office 3 days later, eyes red, voice shaking, hands twisting together like she was holding on to something that kept slipping away. Security buzzed Nia to ask if she knew the visitor. I do, Nia said, but I don't want to see her. Marin waited anyway. When Nia finally stepped into the hallway, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask why. Marin did all the talking. I never meant to hurt you. I was in a bad place. You don't understand how much pressure I was under. You were always so strong. I thought you'd be okay. That was the sentence that ended it. Nia looked at her then, really looked. Not at the friend she'd loved, but at the woman standing in front of her now, frightened, cornered, still reaching for absolution she hadn't earned. "I don't need to understand your reasons," Nia said quietly. "I needed you not to do it." Marin's face crumpled. "Please, we can fix this." "There is no we anymore," Nia replied. "And there hasn't been for a long time." She asked Marin to leave. When Marin didn't move, Nia called security. That night, alone, the grief arrived. Not as a wave, but as a collapse. Nia sat on the bathroom floor and cried until her throat ached, until breathing felt like work. She cried for the years she'd invested, for the trust she'd extended without armor, for the version of herself who had believed closeness meant safety. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the rewriting of memory. Every laugh now felt staged, every shared moment suspect. She replayed conversations, searching for the point where truth had split in two. Wondered how long she'd been the only one in the room who didn't know the script. In the days that followed, she moved through life like someone recovering from surgery, functional, quiet, tender in places no one could see. She went to work. She answered emails. She attended meetings. People remarked on her calm. They didn't see what it cost. Grief without going back was a strange thing. There was no bargaining phase, no fantasy of reconciliation. Just loss, clean and devastating. She missed people who no longer existed, mourned a future that had been built on false premises. But even in the worst moments, especially then, Nia knew something with unwavering certainty. She would not return, not to explanations, not to apologies, not to versions of love that required her silence to survive. She had crossed something irreversible. And though the grief was real and heavy and lonely, it carried with it a quiet truth that anchored her when everything else shook. She had chosen herself, and she would not undo that choice, no matter how much it hurt. The last thing Nia Brooks let go of was the bracelet. It had followed her through everything: shock, silence, strategy, grief. Some nights she caught herself turning it around her wrist absent-mindedly, the way you worry a loose thread even after the garment is ruined. It was beautiful, perfectly crafted, and completely hollow. One evening, months later, Nia stood alone near the edge of the water, the city lights behind her fractured by movement. Her life no longer looked like it used to. A new role, a different apartment, new routines that belonged entirely to her. The chaos had settled into clarity, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it no longer defined the center of her days. Her phone buzzed once. A number she didn't recognize. She didn't open the message. She didn't need to. Instead, she unclasped the bracelet. For a moment, she held it up, watching how it caught the light, how something so expensive could still feel so small. This had been the symbol of her humiliation, the quiet joke, the proof of how deeply she'd been underestimated. It no longer had that power. Nia drew her arm back and let it go. The bracelet disappeared into the dark water without ceremony. No splash loud enough to mark the moment. No witnesses, just release. She exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for nearly a year. Losing them hadn't been the victory. Destroying them hadn't healed her. What changed everything was simpler and harder. She stopped carrying what wasn't hers. She stopped proving, stopped explaining, stopped waiting for acknowledgement that would never come. In the weeks that followed, Nia's life expanded in quiet, undeniable ways. People noticed her work, sought her out, trusted her judgment, not because of who she was connected to, but because of who she was when no one was watching. She had learned something no one had taught her before. The most dangerous betrayal isn't being lied to. It's believing you need permission to leave. The woman she used to be, patient, accommodating, endlessly understanding, had survived the fire. But the woman who emerged was something else entirely. Grounded, precise, unapologetic. She didn't rise by stepping on anyone else. She rose by refusing to stay where she was diminished. And that was the ending they never saw coming. If this story stayed with you, if you recognize yourself in any part of Nia's journey, take a moment to let it be known. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel for more stories about truth, resilience, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. Because sometimes the greatest glow-up isn't revenge.
It's freedom.